Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello.
Bonjour.
Habari za leo.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa, the Africa Centre for Cities, Our Future Cities,
Surge Africa and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Centre,
We are delighted to welcome you to the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival.
Rise Africa is a platform that brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers
to inspire action for sustainable cities.
This is the third edition of our virtual festival.
it brings together insights, practices, and visions from across the continent.
This year's theme is The Cities We Want.
the cities we want.
the cities we want.
The cities we want.
This mirrors the African Union 2063 Agenda Vision, the Africa we want.
It is a wonderful Pan-African call for transformative change.
However, the agenda does not adequately embrace urbanization as a potential positive force for improving prosperity, inclusivity, and environmental well-being on the continent.
We need more emphasis on the role of cities and local action. And this festival aims to provide inputs into this agenda.
The cities we have are
Expanding,
incomplete,
inventive,
contested,
facing impending crisis, yet brimming with potential.
The cities we want are
people-centered,
Safe and healthy.
beacons of culture,
unflinchingly modern.
And adapting to change and leading global innovation.
We'll make these cities through
Experimenting,
learning
collaborating,
and amplifying the everyday actions of people who are shaping their cities.
The festival invites you to embrace different ways of knowing,
It invites you to forge new partnerships,
Experiment with new concepts and ideas.
to seek ways to bridge science, business, policy, and the arts.
Together, let's enter this space in the spirit of poetic possibilities.
À l'encre de mon sang, au papier de ma langue, à mes yeux qui tanguent lentement dans le vide, rêvant un jour de laisser des traces de regard sur les villes que nous voulons et imaginons au-delà des vers. Entre deux effluves, mon être crie utopie, mon cœur murmure héritage. Mon âme, elle, chante avenir. De villes riches de leur multiplicité, multiples dans leur diversité, unique pluralité niée hier s'est avancée vers un demain déjà avorté. Enracinement certes, mais ouverture dans ce village planétaire, laisser les sens alertes et réagir. Entendre la cacophonie banalisée des inégalités sociétales criardes laissées en fond sonore, voir et questionner le décor, bâtir et consentir à l'action qui sépare le rêve de la réalité. Sentir la fragrance vitale, belle et verte, inévitable baume au cœur, accepter notre responsabilité de léguer à nos enfants un monde en bonne santé. Démocratiser le goût, que plus aucun palais, d'aucune bouche, d'aucun enfant, d'aucun pays ne soit plus jamais sec. Démocratiser le goût des rêves, des voyages qui s'exécutent quel que soit l'âge, le long des pages, au fil des chapitres, sur le pupitre de la connaissance, seul germe du choix. Toucher l'idée d'infrastructure qui marche allègrement sur le chemin de l'innovation. Enracinement certes, mais ouverture dans ce village planétaire. Laisser les sens alertes, mais surtout réagir.
Great. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much to the organizers of Rise Africa for bringing into the vision of the cities we want to include cities that are nurturing and emotionally resilient, and that those qualities are connected to action. And so we are bringing to you today a panel that includes myself, Gary Belkin. I am a psychiatrist, although actually unlearn most of my psychiatry and how to really think about mental health from the strengths and perspectives and resources of communities working in the Global South and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And I'm really privileged to be joined by Jennifer Uchendu, who is the founder and director of Susty Vibes and the Eco Anxiety Project, which you will hear more about both soon, and by Dixon Chabanda, who, among many things, is the director and founder of the Africa Mental Health Research Initiative, AMARI, and a professor at the London School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine, and the creator of the Friendship Bench, which really captures, in many ways, the kind of vibrancy and innovation and power of thinking about mental health as an embedded community project that he will also talk about. So I am here to give you a bit of a foregrounding of what we hope to do with everyone in the next hour and a half or so, and to describe in particular an effort called COP Squared, or Care of People times Planet. The intention of that name is to elevate the exponential power, P times P, people times planet, or P squared, the exponential value that caring for people can add to our ability to care for the planet. That sustainability, that resiliency in the face of climate change also involves mindsets and attitudes and behaviors and emotional strengths and social ties, and that we have to be intentional about how we build and grow those things alongside building the infrastructure for more sustainable cities. So I'm going to give you our sense, COP Squared sense, of what it means to do the work of mental health in the face of climate change. Haley, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. There's actually a really great amount of evidence and literature now, evidenced by some of these publications, that identifies the huge effects on populations of climate and environmental change and impact and damage. These reports reflect fairly recent summaries of that evidence, and they involve global mental health professional organizations, the World Health Organization, and most recently a chapter in the IPCC adaptation report just about a year ago that summarized and really validated the high confidence of the evidence that among the many things that climate change does is markedly affects the mental health of populations and communities. The implications of this is not only, though, an added public health burden in climate affected areas, which need to be met more innovatively and thoughtfully. And next slide, Haley. But there's also been increasing attention to the effects of that added public health burden on communities. What is the social impact of that mental health impact as it continues to grow? And that's become of concern more broadly beyond the mental health community. Some of you may be familiar with the most recent UNDP Human Development Report, which is really focused on this issue of what they called a global assault on mental well-being and its implications, not just individually for human development, but how that translates into impacting the ability of whole communities and societies to have the collective efficacy and social ties and strengths to do the kind of problem solving and community-based action and collaborations needed to really step up and meet the challenges of the Anthropocene and of environmental and climate change and damage. And so this is a much broader way of thinking about the consequences, implications of mental health impacts, but also of seeing mental health as a resource, of psychological strengths as key capabilities to keep in mind, and thinking about how we build environmentally resilient cities. Next slide. And so that kind of holistic and very broad social view of what it means to grapple with mental health and climate change, and what we are calling here psychological resilience as part of climate resilience, a bunch of us discovered was a point of view that was being picked up and worked on by a huge array of organizations globally. Just some of them sampled from this snapshot from our website of COP Squared. And I urge you, if you want to learn more about us, to go to COP Squared or COP, the number 2, cop2.org. These organizations represent
cop.org pour voir les partenaires que nous avons.
Health, community-based mental health organizations that have been working on grassroots approaches to mental health for decades. It also includes a range of other activisms and intersectional advocacy areas, focus organizations around youth climate activism, on environmental justice, on gender equity in the face of sustainability, and so forth. And what was really interesting is that all of these threads of growing civic muscle around the implications of climate change and sustainability were each coming from their particular directions and urgencies to this issue of the effect, the emotional, the socio-emotional effects, and building blocks needed to do the work that they were doing. And so COP Squared was formed to try to capture that diversity of perspective, and to create a learning network and knowledge exchange where we could piece together the ways that psychological resilience could be built in and mutually reinforce these other forms of resilience building. That mental health wasn't this thing that sits aside somewhere, but is really woven into the work, this broad work of adapting to the circumstances of climate and environmental change. And it's that perspective that we are trying to put to work, to implement, and to grow and spread, not through just mental health organizations, but through all of civil society that is mobilized around climate and environmental change. Next slide. And so one of our first efforts was to engage with the UN High-Level Champions Office effort on the race to resilience. If those of you who may not be aware of the race to resilience, this is a massive global mobilization of effort to accelerate the capacity for adaptation at community and levels globally, but with a focus on the most highly vulnerable and climate adversity facing places on Earth, which really means reaching 4 billion people by 2030 as the goal of the race to resilience, to enhance climate resilience. And by what they mean by climate resilience is to try to impact what this diagram shows as 6 key systems that are to be the focus of making more resilient. And this strategy was detailed in the most recent COP meeting at Sharm el-Sheikh, in what was called the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, issued by the High-Level Champions Office and the COP presidency, that identified this goal. And you can see the 6 systems here, things like food and agriculture systems, water systems, human settlement systems, which is housing, and infrastructure, which refers to especially transportation and electric systems, as well as what they call cross-cutting systems, which involves most planning or governance and finance systems. And so we met with the high-level champions and persuaded them that these efforts, which are mostly affecting physical infrastructure and system strengthening and technology and really reinforcing things, should also acknowledge the fact that it takes resilient people to sustain resilient places and to do this work and cope with and enable and enact and carry these transitions. And so that of all things, the race to resilience should also include the goal of building capacity to grow and deepen the psychological resilience of 4 billion people by 2030. And so the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda document includes the goal of exploring how the race to resilience does that. And our task, COP Squared and where I'm based, the Billion Minds Institute of Columbia University, to craft a strategic roadmap as to how the race to resilience does that. And as a part of doing that, we are trying to not only create a strategic plan, but also launch at next COP what we're calling early adopters that put that plan to work, specifically to identify race to resilience partners in each of these 6 systems who, within the work they're already doing, show how they can also be channels for growing psychological resilience. To give you some brief examples, so for example, in the human settlement systems, one of the key partner for race resilience there in terms of promoting the structural integrity and strengthening of informal settlements globally is Slum Dwellers International. And so we're designing with them an effort where they will also be able to spread skills to youth in these settlements for them to lead peer-run emotional support groups. So within the work and networks that they're mobilizing people that are already existing, is to also embed the work of psychological resilience. That is very much a kind of ground game kind of approach, starting with urban settings that they are in. But there's also great interest, for example, in looking at food and agriculture systems. How do we support and strengthen and give emotional resources to farmers globally, who we know have very high rates of reported mental illness, even suicidality, in the face of climate and other global pressures. So each of these systems becomes a path to grow psychological resilience. So it's really taking what we thought was, and we've often treated mental health work as something that is part of the mental health and health systems, is to really change how that work can happen and be picked up really anywhere by anyone. And we think this is a model that is particularly valuable in cities and has been applied there. Next slide. And indeed, there's a huge amount of evidence of how to do this, of how to basically put skills in other people's hands to do what has often been relied upon by mental health specialists in terms of not only care for mental health symptoms and distress and trauma, which we know all are elevated in the midst of climate pressures, but to also do the work, as evidenced by some of these titles here, the way to do prevention and promotion and build psychological strengths through these same community-led, layperson-led, other system-led work. And those building those fabrics of emotional strengths is really what I call trying to keep our cities nurturing engines, even in the face of real challenges, because those nurturing engines are really essential for also other community action and empowerment. Next slide. And putting that idea to work, I got to do at great scale when I was the mental health commissioner of New York City. You see a map of New York City here. Each of these dots is actually a geolocated, a geocoded location where in some other setting than a mental health clinic, in a job training program, in a daycare center, in a school, in a homeless person support shelter, in all these other places, there was some degree of sharing of skills to the staff working there to be front lines to the mental health needs of the people that they're touching, serving, and helping. And this really was a kind of catalytic approach that brought in other parts of government, so education departments and community development departments, and the childcare system, and just a whole array of city services became mental health owners of a mental health and psychological resilience agenda by this spread, this change of real estate, this putting in the water, in the city's water, mental health skills, capacities, and partnerings to identify needs in these neighborhoods that we could address through this process. And come away with this vision of these dots as really the perpetuation and propagation of the work of psychological resilience and helping underscore a strong social fabric to do many other things. And this idea, as I said, I learned from working outside of this country, and the Africa region in particular has been a hotbed of innovation and original work in this area, and much of the evidence for doing this work. And this is true of our next two speakers. Jennifer, as I mentioned, who founded and led the Eco Anxiety Project, as well as Susty Vibes, which works with empowering youth, but also emotionally supporting and giving a space for emotional sharing work for youth, and activating them and empowering them to work on sustainability where they are. And Dixon and the African Mental Health Research Initiative, Amari and Dixon, has been really a global leader in spreading and really smartly innovating these approaches of putting skills in community members' hands to grow and spread psychological resilience. Some efforts about how to think about how government can pick up and be a support system to this kind of approach. Some of the very early work in really thinking about implementation at scale, also rooted in the African continent by some network efforts called Prime and another network, Emerald. These really set the pace that I used when I was in New York City of lessons learned about how city government can really be a host to spread and own and marshal the array of sectors and stakeholders that really had a thirst for and a need for this more holistic and community-driven way of doing psychological resilience building. So before I hand over the screen to Jennifer and then Dixon to deeper dive into some of this framing, is what we hope to do after we talk and get questions that may arise from what we're talking that we can answer, is to break out, next slide, Haley, thanks, is to, okay, so go back. So it looks like there's a slide I had, which I'll just read and we'll return to, is we're going to go into breakout groups with all of you and explore some questions about, thank you, about, from your perspectives, how what we're talking about resonates with you. How have these issues and maybe even thinking of these kinds of approaches arisen where you are at? What would you need to try to address these issues? And we also are going to specifically ask a very practical question And as COP Squared grows as in terms of regional networks, Dixon also leads our Africa hub and regional hub for COP Squared, is to work regionally through these networks. And I believe the Africa Network now has about 60 or 70 organization members across the continent. And that's in addition to Dixon's own research network. Is how can we use these networks as hosts or collaborating with other existing networks to host learning exchanges across the region in this area for stakeholders in urban sustainability to share learning and to learn more about how within that work of urban sustainability can be psychological resilience and sustainability. So we will turn to you as experts. We will turn to you as experts on thinking about that. What might such a learning network look like? What needs should it fill? And would that be of interest and value? So that's our game plan for the next hour and a half or so. And I'm going to turn now to Jennifer to talk about her work and also flesh a bit about this mixture that we're aiming for to get to its scale of emotional care, but also empowering change. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Gary. And hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed watching the earlier.
J'ai adoré regarder la vidéo qui parlait des villes que nous voulons. Gary nous a donné un point de vue très technique de cette discussion. Et
my perspective of what this looks like from my work at Susty Vibes in Nigeria, and also just more broadly looking at what does it mean to do work on mental health and climate change, climate action from an African perspective. My name is Jennifer Uchendu. I'm the founder of Susty Vibes. Next slide. And Susty Vibes is basically an organization I founded 7 years ago to make sustainability actionable, relatable, and cool for young people. And before now, we would say young people in Nigeria, but we've realized that our work has gone beyond Nigeria, and more young people from Africa and the global South relate to the principles of our work, you know, the way that we see these intersections, and why it is important to safeguard and support climate emotions for young people. While I'm still speaking, I think it will be good to know how some of you feel about when you think about the environment or climate change in your city. What feelings come to mind? I always like to do this exercise in rooms like this because people get to, you know, express how, you know, their environment or their city makes them feel. And I'm currently working on a project with my team on cities and climate emotions, you know, and it'd be good to see, you know, just tell me your city and tell me the emotions you feel. I think for Lagos, a lot of the times we feel indifferent. Sometimes we feel numb because we don't really know what's happening. There's a lot of progress on one side, and sometimes you see trees still being cut down and whatnot. So if you can oblige me in the comments, kindly let me know your city and how it makes you feel when you think about climate change and the environment. Next slide. So today, I basically want to talk about the Eco-Anxiety Africa project, which is something that we are working on in Nigeria. We started this in 2022, so just about last year, where we wanted to have a hub or a project, as it were, to address eco-anxiety in Africa from an African perspective. And it really started from, you know, curiosity and an inquiry into why is it that whenever you hear these conversations around climate change and mental health, it's really not coming from Africa. Whereas the reality is that the vulnerabilities, the impacts, and all of the related impacts of the crisis are hitting us in Africa even, worse. So for us as young people who were already doing a lot of work in climate change advocacy, community projects, we wanted to create a space and a project to really investigate why this is not happening, but more importantly, to find ways to support ourselves, as young people. And that was how it was bettered, really. Thank you for everyone who has put something on the chat. I see people talk about feeling gloomy for Lagos. Dito Ayer, someone has said they feel alarmed for Cape Town. Concerned for Cape Town. I definitely agree with all of the issues with water. I definitely agree. South Africa, alarmed and concerned, it's a good perspective and an emotion, that you would relate to. Thank you. Looking forward to more comments. Next slide, please. So what exactly do we do at the Eco-Anxiety Africa project? The first thing that we do, next slide, is research. I mentioned finding ways to do research as Africans for Africans. I think it's really important. I started my career, as an activist, a young person who was really passionate about sustainability and climate action. But I realized that if we don't support with the right data, if we don't seek out our own stories, then we're just going to work with whatever it is we found. So research has been a very important part of our work at the Eco-Anxiety Africa project, constantly speaking to people to find out the Nigerian or African perspective of this intersection between climate change and mental health, constantly asking people, how do you explain or how do you describe psychological resilience within the climate crisis, and what does it mean for you as an African? Next slide. The second thing is around space making. And, Gary has brilliantly talked about the work that COP Squared does in terms of bringing people together and spaces even like this to discuss this intersection. So Susty Vibes and, TIP in all are constantly looking for spaces to have these dialogues for us as Africans to talk about climate change and mental health from an African perspective, and using our own voice, because for us, what space really does is to validate these emotions. When you come into a space, there is an empowering feeling you get when you find people who look like you, live with you, tell you about this impact and how it makes them feel. And within space, we can decide, we can discuss strategies to support each other. We can discuss action. We can build a next step further. Next slide. And obviously, after you create a space, the next thing is action, right? And Susty Vibes has already, for the last 7 years, been very big on community action. But now TIP is looking at how do we translate these emotions, these fears, this anxiety, this hope, and all of the different range of emotions that we feel. How do we translate it into action? How do we pick ourselves up and continue to build resilience in our own way? Next slide. And the final thing we do is climate-aware psychotherapy. And if you're an African, hearing this, you're probably going to be like, well, is this even possible? But yes, we're looking for ways to work with more mental health professionals to understand these linkages between the climate crisis and more broadly, environmental issues, biodiversity loss, and all of the different fabrics that impact us, as people who live in Africa. And then we're looking at ways to support each other, provide the right therapy, the right tools. Gary talked about rethinking psychiatry as it were. That is what we're looking to do, working hand in hand with mental health professionals for ourselves in our community at Susty Vibes, but more broadly, to the African community. And we've had conversations, dialogues with other professionals, looking at ways we can do this for the continent. Next slide. And so here I've just put, a few pictures of our work, some of the work that we've done. We've worked with, elders in Lagos who are age 55 and above, bringing them together with young people age 18 to 35 to talk about climate distress in Lagos and what that looks like. What does it present as when we talk about impacts of climate change in Lagos with the floods, and how inaction, government inaction, community inaction contributes to this general sense of distress, and how, possibly we could leverage on intergenerational wisdom to build the resilience that's needed. The second picture is around, something called Street Conference we do at Susty Vibes, where young people literally are going out into the streets to talk to people about climate change, talk to them about pollution, talk to them about environmental protection, and how we can, start to think about changing our lifestyle, through one-on-one conversations. And this is a good example of, community action and young people being empowered to take action. So rather than, having a space where we just talk about the problems and how negatively we're impacted, we're learning to take action, to go out into the streets and to change the awareness and the mindset of how people think about these issues. We also host a lot of webinars. Every month at TIP, we have one webinar where we're focused on talking more about these intersections and looking at particular topics that would be relevant to the continent. A few weeks ago, we had one on Gen Z in Africa and looking at the relationship between climate change and mental health and how this, particular population groups feel about the issues and what they want to see. And I know that fits really right with the theme for this event, looking at the cities we want. How do you know the cities you want when you don't involve the young people, who live in those cities? So those are some of the thinkings, around our work at TIP. Something else we've done is to host parties as young people. We say we're youth-led and we're youth-focused. So parties are a great way to bring young people together. And within those parties, we are now having conversations on climate change, the climate crisis, and how it impacts our mental health, validating these emotions to, young people who come together, and then leaving those spaces with people having a sense of empowerment, a sense of agency that they can take action and they can do something. We've gone out to schools, to continue to have these conversations, because outside of the curriculum, you don't always find critical climate change conversations. And then also hosting policy workshops where we bring in leaders from the government, urban planners, everyone together to look at some research that's ongoing about these interlinkages. So this has been, an interesting experience and journey for us, bringing this work, into Africa, looking for a way to do it as young people in ways that feel very authentic and empowering for us. Next slide. Thank you. And what have we learned so far? Just looking through the slides, through the chat rather, I see someone from Namibia says they feel lonely and sometimes they don't know what to do, nothing to do. That's a very interesting emotion. Someone from Cape Town, Paul, says abundant nature, but sometimes socially disconnected. So those are all valid. And I can't wait to, be in our breakout rooms where we discuss some of this and what, a next step looks like. So at TIP, what really have we learned so far in the last couple of months that we've been working? Next slide. I think, as earlier stated, spaces for dialogues matter. Spaces like this, spaces like, the ones we're looking to form after now are important to talk about these issues, because that is how change starts, when you at least name and discuss, what these experiences look like, what the problems are, and what solutions, can be shaped as. Next slide. So a second thing that we've learned is that validating climate emotions are critical for psychological resilience. And Gary touched a bit on that, looking at world reports, looking at how the world is feeling, how people are feeling post-COVID, and with everything going on, it is important to validate these emotions because they are critically important to whatever sense of climate adaptation or mitigation, that we plan technically and whatnot. It's important to look at the psychological impacts of these issues. What does it mean for people at the community level, at the city level? That is one thing that we have learned. Next slide. A third thing is around people needing enabling environments to act for climate. And the initial video already explains this. You can't talk about a city that's not safe, that's not healthy, that is not conducive for people. So for example, can young people come together to protest or go on a strike or talk about these climate issues without fear of being arrested and whatnot? So those are some of the issues. What does action look like in a city? And those are some of the things that we've learned as being very critical and important to pushing the needle forward on conversations on climate change and mental health. Next slide. We also learned, that these climate emotions need to be safeguarded. Initially, there was this conversation on, oh, it's a terrible thing to be feeling this way. And, that idea of pathologizing these emotions or this kind of state of mind for a lot of young people. And we've learned that what we need to do instead is to safeguard these emotions, hold space to discuss and explore them, while at the same time transforming them into hope, into action, into solidarity, and into resilience. Next slide. Another thing we've learned as young people is that eco-gaslighting, one of my favorite words I learned last year, can be a negative trigger. And what do I mean by eco-gaslighting? Oftentimes we'll find that, government agencies and government leaders make very bogus promises of what they've done, what they are trying to do. And when you look at it, it's only on paper. In action, there are no tangible, progress into how to actually implement this. And that idea of gaslighting young people and, making these lofty promises can be a negative trigger, especially for young people who are experiencing eco-anxiety or any negative climate emotions for that matter. Next slide. And then finally, it's that young people are experiencing a burden of hope. Oftentimes I go into spaces and rooms and they talk about how young people are the future and we're going to change the world. And I wonder who exactly has the power to change the world right now and what are they doing with that power? So that burden of hope that we often place on young people, it's not fair. It's not always fair. It provides a power dynamic where we feel pressured and overwhelmed and, even worsens these feelings of eco-anxiety. And I think finally now, next slide. Yes, I really wanted to mention this idea of loss and damage. It came up a lot at COP27 in Egypt. Loss and damage, the different ways that people in the global south and in developing countries are experiencing the climate crisis and related impacts, and how there is loss and there's damage that oftentimes are non-financial. We really have seen that these issues are also social justice issues. So it's not just an environmental, thing to be pushed to the side for the environmentalists to deal with, but it's social, it's a mental health issue. There are things that need to be addressed holistically. And, everyone needs
recevoir une réponse et tout le monde doit se rassembler autour de la table pour voir comment rendre les villes plus résilientes.
Recognizing that these issues, must be brought to fore. Thank you. Next slide. And so that's pretty much the end of my, very brief summary of talking about our work at Susty Vibes and also the work that we do at TEEP. I'm looking forward to the breakout session where we discuss more about the questions and also look deeply at some of these issues. I will now pass on to Dixon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And so mine is really a continuation from where Jennifer left off, where I will share how we have leveraged a community resource to address a wide range of issues that are quite prevalent in communities across Zimbabwe and beyond. Next slide, please. I have been working with community grandmothers for just over a decade, where we have been training community grandmothers to treat depression in their communities from wooden park benches, similar to what you see here. So just over 10 years, 10 years ago, it occurred to me that one of the most underutilized human resource in African communities are grandmothers. Because when you really think about it, grandmothers are kind of the custodians of that local culture, knowledge, and wisdom. And so when I lost a client of mine to suicide, I realized that I had to find a way of really taking mental health out of the institution where I was working and taking it to the community. And the most sort of reliable resource at the time and to this day were grandmothers. Next slide. So this is a file photograph of one of our grandmothers, one of our longest serving grandmothers. We call her Gogo Zukwa. Gogo Zukwa has been working with Friendship Bench for over 8 years. What we do in our communities is we really equip these grandmothers with the basic skills of cognitive behavioral therapy. We then allocate them a wooden park bench in their community. We facilitate referrals to the wooden bench through social media, through existing non-governmental organizations, police stations, schools, and they receive sessions on the bench after they've been screened. Next slide. And the work that we have been doing is captured in over 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. But this is really one of our most seminal publication, which Gary also touched on in one of his slides. It was a cluster randomized controlled trial, which showed, next slide, which showed that, that 6 months after receiving therapy from a grandmother, folks were symptom-free, and these grandmothers had managed to alleviate even suicidal ideations. We compared the grandmother's therapy, which is delivered on a park bench, to usual care or enhanced usual care, which was trained mental health nurses, psychiatrists, and psychologists. So this was really an exciting moment for our team. Next slide. And so since then, what we really have been doing is working predominantly with elderly women in our communities whose average age is 72. Here is another file photograph of some of these dear grandmothers that I work with. And when it comes to climate change, there's an intersection which becomes very important at a cultural level, because when you get into communities, the most affected people as a result of some of the issues around climate are the poor. And in the communities where we work, these grandmothers who are part of the poor interact on a day-to-day basis with the communities. They are familiar with those who are affected, whether it's as a result of drought or we've had a flood situation. So they provide this support, which really is a form of resilience, which enables people to go out there and continue to do the things that they are doing, or to actually, prevail in the face of adversity. Next slide. The actual model is very simple. As I said, we train trainers who then train grandmothers. We allocate the grandmothers a wooden park bench. People receive anything between 4 to 6 sessions. After those sessions, they join a support group. And I just want to briefly focus on the support groups. Next slide. One of the most powerful aspect of the support groups. We can have the next slide. One of the most powerful aspects of the support groups is that they enable communities to collectively problem solve around a wide range of issues, including climate-related challenges. And this is the model that we've actually scaled across Zimbabwe. This year alone, we are going to be reaching out to over 400,000 people. That means we have more than 2,000 grandmothers in Zimbabwe, and these 2,000 grandmothers will provide therapy to approximately 400,000 people. That is people receiving support, structured mental health talk therapy from a grandmother on a wooden park bench. And this is the model we have been scaling for the past 8 years. And this year, we are finally going to have a friendship bench in every province in Zimbabwe, which brings us closer to realizing our vision of having a friendship bench within walking distance for everyone in Zimbabwe. Next slide. And this next slide really highlights the economic benefits of having friendship bench. It shows the cost effectiveness of this task shifting model in comparison to a lot of existing services that are out there. Next slide. Yeah, and this again is just a reflection of the support groups. The support groups are really one of the most powerful components of our work because they enable communities to collectively problem solve around a wide range of issues. So what happens in the support groups is folks who have received therapy from a grandmother on a bench go on to join a support group. And imagine bringing together 20, 30 people who have all experienced the same kind of therapy, which brings components of problem-solving therapy and behavior activation. After the therapy sessions, they are brought together and they use those skills to collectively problem solve around a wide range of issues that they're facing in their communities, which include issues around climate. Next slide. And we've replicated the model in a number of places in Zimbabwe and beyond. This is just one of our replication within an HIV population. The red lines going down show change after a year of receiving friendship bench. Blue line was a comparison, which is the usual care. Next slide. And the next slide shows a replication. And again, this is a clinical trial in a rural setting where we compared friendship bench against the MH gap. And after 12 months, friendship bench, well, both friendship bench and MH gap were effective. Friendship bench was a lot better. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that our replications have been outside of Zimbabwe as well. Most recently, we completed a replication in Colombia. Prior to that, we had replicated in Vietnam. But I'm showing these pictures just to highlight where we began. One of our very first replication or introduction of friendship bench outside of Zimbabwe was in New York City. And this was the first time I actually met Gary. And since then, we've really been in touch. So that was one of our really successful stories, New York City. And from New York City, we went on to Zanzibar in a completely different cultural setting where we introduced Dawati Rafiki, which is the Swahili equivalent of friendship bench. And again, Dawati Rafiki is still running in Zanzibar. Next slide. Yeah, and that's my last slide. And if you want to really know more about the Friendship Bench, you can visit our website. This has really been just an overview of what we're doing and where we're coming from. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jennifer and Dixon. Dixon mentioned our work in New York City. And
On a mentionné notre travail à New York, donc beaucoup des points que vous voyez sur notre carte étaient les bancs de l'amitié.
We used Dixon's manual. We actually had Dixon come to New York City. And we deployed them in a way where they were sort of pop-ups in neighborhoods where some traumatic event happened, or in areas of the city that had few mental health resources. We brought them to health fairs, street fairs, and for several months had 80,000 contacts. So I hope, Jennifer, this taste of what's possible from Jennifer and from Dixon in really, this is a new kind of mental health. And I hope that's come across that one, the psychological and emotional fabric of our urban communities are essential foundations for all sorts of community action, particularly in the face of adversities like climate change, which changes everything and needs that fabric to be strong. But I also hope you get a flavor and kind of provoke the imagination of how that work can be everyone's business and can be dynamic and flexible and creative and highly participatory, inspiring, fun, and also how it is super far-reaching in the way mental health work just has not been really getting into the life worlds of communities and really connecting care with change making and community problem solving and mobilizing. And so that's the vision of psychological resilience that COP Squared is about, growing and normalizing and mainstreaming and networking. And so before we turn to get thoughts of how this strikes you and feels resonant or not, or similar or not to things that you face in your communities, and ideas about how a potential learning network and capacity across the region might be of value to you in your work. Before we turn to that in the breakouts, I just wanted to open the floor if there are any questions for either myself or Jennifer or Dixon. I'm looking in the chat for if any questions have shown up. I see there was something about the notion of gaslighting to Jennifer, which she responded to. If there are any other questions, we're small enough to raise your hand, and otherwise we can move on to the breakouts. I'll just scan the room for a bit. I'm seeing hands, and I'm Nontusuelo. I think I'm going to destroy your name. I'm sorry, my pronunciation, but why don't you have the floor if we can unmute you with a question.
Thanks. It's pronounced Nontutuzello. So I wanted to ask about the from Dixon, just regarding the training of the essentially the practitioners who are supporting the communities. How does that work, or how is it organized, and how do you identify then that these are the right people, and that essentially for themselves as well mentally, in terms of their own mental health, that they have the capacity to be able to support others in this instance, given the, I guess, also the challenges that the community overall is facing?
Thank you. Those were several questions. I'll try and see if I can answer all of them. So firstly, we look at very basic core competencies to help us decide who is able to do this work. So the core competencies we look for in the grandmothers mainly ability to read and write. And then we also look for empathy, that is the ability to make people feel respected and understood. And fortunately, most grandmothers have that. And we've realized over the years that if you have that combo, everything else can be taught. The most difficult thing to teach a person is empathy. But the other things, how to deliver the intervention, the structured, problem-solving therapy and behavior activation, that is something that we don't normally struggle with. So that's the first thing that we do. And the training normally takes 3 weeks. And then after the 3 weeks, they go on to a practical sort of attachment in the community where each grandmother is expected to see at least 4 clients under supervision. They are then reassessed after seeing the 4 clients, and grandmothers who do well are then allowed to start seeing clients on their own. And of course, with the 4 clients that they see, the sessions are audio recorded, and we use a checklist to establish whether they've gone through the steps of our protocol or not. And so the training really is based on principles of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, with emphasis on problem-solving, behavior activation. But we use a lot of indigenous concepts to train. That's the other reason why the training is pretty sort of intuitive. We use local terms like kuvurapfungwa, which literally means opening the mind, kusimudzira, which means uplifting, kusimbisa, which means strengthening. Those are the 3 key pillars of friendship bench training, and the grandmothers grasp that instantly. Yeah, I'll stop there. I'm not sure if I've left anything else.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
And Paul, I see you have a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for really, really fabulous inputs. I still find it really interesting how, on the one hand, it feels like conversations about mental health are gaining traction in this space, and yet there's often hesitance to enter this space. Jennifer, the side conversation on eco-gaslighting, I think, is really interesting to me. And, my reflection is that we use talk in many of our roles as advocates for this quite a lot, and pushing and talking and trying to share ideas, and through our talk normalize a sort of I'm kind of speaking a bit in a meta way about RISE as an example of this, but to normalize a set of ideas or practices. And in your reflection here, where you've said, effectively we're gaslighting young people by making promises and then not delivering upon them as governments or people in power, as practitioners in the advocacy space, do we need to be more wary about the talk and arguments that we're weaving, around this? And I know that might be a bit of an ethereal question, but, do you have some recommendations about how to steer this way? Because as to concretize that sort of line of thinking, we do a lot of process work where we do consultations and bring people together, and it is very important, and that process and those learnings and the shared experience and solidarity there is valuable. But at the end of the process, there's often that, now so what, you've come and we're now expecting that this is going to turn into a demonstration project, a infrastructure investment, but then often the process and the talk is so far away from the traditional ways that resources are brought into the space that we then can't deliver on that, and that just seeds this frustration. So I've become a bit more wary about a lot of the processes that we're running, but at certain points when your tools are...
À certains points, quand vos outils sont vraiment le don de la parole, comment est-ce que vous pouvez l'utiliser dans cet espace sans faire de fausses promesses?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. That is such a big question, something I would, obviously continue to think of even after now. I think as a young person doing this work, I've realized that, spaces, as I mentioned, for dialogue is important, but the content, is what matters. What exactly are we talking about? How are we, letting space for others to react? Is it safe for them to react to the conversations, the processes or the promises? can people be curious or investigate some of these things that we talk about, even as advocates, or NGO leaders and whatnot? Can people ask questions? Do we have systems where it's very open, and even within the barriers and limitations of so much conversations, can we have back and forth where we can learn from, those conversations? I think that oftentimes that has been missing. There's always that idea of someone talking back at someone, and we just have to listen and take it all in. So I think it's more about dialogue and creating more spaces for dialogue, where there's, a feedback system or a feedback loop that oftentimes I think is missing. But, thank you for that question. There's definitely so much to think about, even as someone who runs, an NGO myself, and constantly, having conversations and advocacy. I guess it's that thin line between when is it advocacy, when do we need action, when do we need activism, and all of those three things can coexist in one. But ultimately, are people feeling empowered by this process? Are we building resilience? Are the concepts of solidarity, and empathy, as Dixon mentioned, are they weaved into these processes? Ultimately, those are the things that build for effective psychological resilience. And if it's missing, then we would oftentimes see the gaps show up in the people that we work with. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. So we're going to shift to the breakout groups, and we're a small group. So I think, I hope you take advantage of that time and space to really reflect on some of the questions we're asking, or anything else you want to reflect on. Haley, if you could show up the questions again, or put them in the chat, which were to ask, how do you see these issues resonate where you are? And what maybe have you tried, or would you need to try to do more to address them? And what do you think of the prospects and the purposes of building out more of a learning network, a COP Squared through our hub with Dixon's leadership, and Jennifer's also on our board. We're thinking, how do we leverage our networks to support such activity? And so what, from your perspectives, would be helpful about that? And who should we bring into such learning networks and partnerships? So if we could just quickly go around the room, if I don't know if you self-appointed anyone, or can on the spot have someone who is in each of your respective rooms to give a flavor of what the reflections were and thoughts in the room, starting with whoever was with Jennifer.
Okay, that would be Ayo.
I think Ayo dropped off.
Oh, I see.
Oh, she just fell off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm happy to take on what we discussed. Our room was very interesting, slightly diverse, because we had Nigeria and South Africa, and we talked about, to the very first question, in terms of mental health issues and how realities of, apartheid, stress, corruption,
corruption, l'interface avec
times in our cities, and how for Paul in Cape Town, the realities of, seeing the aftermath of apartheid, and how people are just continually in poverty and just unequal kind of living conditions, and how that can be stressful for someone else on the other divide, who is slightly more privileged, and has access to, housing and a job and all of that. And in terms of what to do, we talked about empathy, empathy for oneself, empathy for others, as being a good way and a good buffer to at least live, in these societies that are very kind of unequal. We also talked about how a lot of these next steps and solutions actually have to come from the government and power holders, which really is the reality. In terms of the learning network, we all agreed that this is definitely useful. But again, you know, someone had mentioned how it was Aya who mentioned how it's important for us to have information flows across professions and sectors. You know, having an on-hand approach, on-deck approach is great. But, you know, Paul talking about how do we do this in ways that are very tangible and we don't overwhelm, you know, people with an extra layer of meetings or an event. And more importantly, how do we mainstream mental health in some of these other sectors like transportation, you know, where it's evident, you know, how the impact and success looks like. So that could be one thing the learning network starts to think of as it comes together, ways to measure success, you know, across the sectors, across the people who come in. And there was a very interesting example of, you know, hooting and transportation, noise pollution, what has been done in Europe versus what, you know, it's at play in Africa. I thought that was a very good, you know, example. And then finally, in terms of who should we bring in, you know, we said virtually everyone, if possible, you know, psychologists, financial analysts, but more importantly, we need to find champions who are happy to push the agenda and also enable them, you know, with platforms to speak more about these issues. And then also having a top-down approach where we can get political buy-in can be very important. And then finally, looking at grassroots organizations, and COP Squared, you know, already knows how important this is in terms of grassroots organizations who are already working on mental health or social well-being and having them involved in these conversations, because oftentimes they know how to, you know, reach people kind of more directly. And that was it for our group. Thank you, and over to you, Gary.
Great, thanks a lot. A rich conversation. And someone from Dixon's, who's in Dixon's room.
Hi, thank you. So we had a discussion, I mean, specific to, prior to answering the questions that were provided, something that Funmi brought up was around whether the mental health issues are prioritized in our cities in the first place. And so this is specific to the Global South and how, you know, even before we speak to its intersection with climate change, if it's prioritized at all. And so moving away from, finding ways of moving away from mental health stereotypes within, you know, the Global South narratives, which often comes back to cultural and religious perceptions and the influence of cultural and religious leadership and structures to understand issues around mental health, and then also openness to discuss and have accessibility to mental health services in the Global South again, and how that can be prioritized better. And then also looking at mental health literacy as overall as a need and something that's needed for you know, understanding how this is accessible. And then something that Tashi also brought up was around the implementation of mental health care services within the South African context, and bringing in also children and the care for children, in addition to the accessibility and also kind of the embedded stereotypes again for men specifically. And so one of the things that was kind of considered around that is then from Dixon's inputs and perspectives around the framing and the use of language around the issues. So shifting away from the Western framing of mental health care services and support that is needed. And so that removes then the issues around stigma and rather opens the conversation around Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous, and even the language that is used around the care services and the mental health support provided, and that can take away the issues around the stigma, because it's a language that people know and have grown up with and culturally is known. And then also that can reduce the stigma. And then looking at also who then are the sort of actors and additional structures that can be brought in. Again, considering the Global South perspective is around community and religious leaders, there was some consideration also of how traditional leaders can be brought in to speak to and support these issues as people who are with indigenous knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge themselves, and so how they can be brought into support. And given that a lot of people generally do tend to consult them around mental health related issues. Yeah, if there's anything else I missed, somebody can add for me. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. And I really love the point that while this really has resonated within the climate community as a way to really reach deeply into communities, these kinds of approaches that Jennifer and Dixon are working on and examples of, it's just a better way to do mental health, period. Irrespective of a climate context or not. And because it really breaks through those obstacles in our current system of being too institutionalized, too Western-based, too detached from the social and cultural context through which emotional burdens come. And it reminds me, we did the friendship benches, for example, in New York City with large faith communities where members of congregations volunteered to be counselors on friendship benches. And so, how more contextually can you get? And it's a real great potential of this, a much more flexible and immersive way of thinking about doing the work. And then say you were in my group. So if you could share your thoughts and reflections on what we talked about, and then we'll close out. Thanks.
Hi everyone, good evening. So it's very exciting to be with Gary on this breakout section. And I think I'll just start with the last question that asks, who should we bring to such networks? And then we started by talking about, first the government, private sector, and then we talked about the people in general. One thing we've talked about for people is, first of all, we're talking about the cities we want. So when we talk about cities in Nigeria, or when we talk about cities in Africa, the first thing that we need to do is to put climate change in perspective for them, because a lot of people are going through eco-anxiety and they don't even know it. And I gave the example of what would happen if rain was falling, and I'm happy that rain is falling, but then I'm also sad that, there's the possibility that, there might not be light after because rain just fell, and then that just stresses me out. So, and then we also now talked about what community building can do. So when we have these communities, it can help people. I know someone mentioned that, when Jennifer was talking, that climate action and mental health, they feel sort of lonely. So what communities like, Corp Squared can do is to help sort of bridge that gap where you feel like, okay, I'm not alone and my feelings are valid. And then you can now work together as a community for solutions. And then we also talked about government. And I think that when it comes to government, just like Gary mentioned, it's important that we go in with sort of like an optimistic mindset, because we understand that a lot of the government in Africa, in the cities and around Africa, may not be the best, but they do have a big role to play, and the larger role ultimately falls on them. So when it comes to policy building, they have a huge role to play, and it's important that we sort of bring them in. I feel like if we talk about Nigeria specifically, the government is starting to put a little bit more efforts into, things like climate action. And I mentioned that we do get to work with, some government agencies in our work at Susty Vibes, like the Lagos State Waste Management, and they are most times open to these ideas. And, governments would also help when it comes to building, mental health supports through the facilities that we already have, through the health facilities that we already have. I think we also mentioned that, for a lot of Nigerians, when it comes to mental health, they have they attach a sort of negative meaning to it. I mean, there's this place that everybody knows. If you're Nigerian, you probably know where Yaba Left is, and you know that once you hear Yaba Left, it just comes with a negative feeling. It's not always for mad people, but places like this can actually help, build communities that can help with both mental health and climate action. And then also one thing we also discussed was the friendship bench ideas, which I think is amazing. And then when we talk about people, first of all, there's the younger people, like Gary mentioned, that we tried out the friendship bench. And then there's the older people. And we mentioned that for a lot of Nigerians, we place a lot of respect on our elderly people. And it will be very important. How do I put this now? So I would really love to hear the advice that an elderly person would have for me. And, when it comes to, that just reminded me that when it comes to bringing solutions for climate change and mental health, it is very important that we conceptualize it for the people that we are dealing with. So when it comes to, say, a city in Nigeria, there are most likely two things that Nigerians care about. Say, first of all, Nigerians are very religious. And like you mentioned, you tried out friendship bench with religious organizations. So I feel like that's a model that could work. And then the elderly people as well. And I think that a third thing that many cities across Nigeria are also passionate about would be money, because there's a lot of poverty around, and especially for young people, every young person is trying to make money. So if you want to address climate change and mental health for them, you have to bring something that has to be sort of free, because I'm not able to send money to it. You're not telling me that I have to pay for mental health support. Like, where is the balance? So yeah, I think for me, that's just what I'll summarize it as. So what sort of people, what should we bring into SWOT network? So first is the government, then it's what the private sector can do, then it's what people can do, from young people to elderly people. We also mentioned the importance of intergenerational, wisdom and knowledge. And yeah, so I'll just summarize it like that. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And we're past time, so I just want to thank everybody for joining this conversation. It's been very helpful to us, and as in our journey at COP Square, to think about how in our 70 organization Africa Hub can be useful to help grow and network this sharing of practices with all those constituencies, government, local organizations, community organizations, and the general public. For a stronger, psychologically resilient social fabric, ready for the challenges ahead. So thank you, and thank you again to the organizers for bringing this topic in.